My family immigration story begins with George Grey. George Grey was born in Northumberland County, England in 1760. In 1788, George married 22-year-old Agnes Aitchison, born in Scotland just over Northumberland County border. In Northumberland, George ran a wheelwright and cabinet maker business. He had a fair education, had excellent habits and character, and was a devoted Christian. Agnes Aitchison had the same quality of education that George did, if not better. Together, George and Agnes were well respected in their town and gave birth to 6 children, including Margaret, Andrew, William, John, Elizabeth, and Walter. Even though the Greys had education, a business, and a wonderful family, they still wanted more. In the beginning of the 19th century, George's business afforded him with little more than a bare livelihood. He and some friends, previous neighbors, who had immigrated to the United States a few years before, advertised about the United States' beauty, cheap land, and good climate. With that, George decided that the U.S. would provide his family with a better life than it currently did in England. So the Greys and 13 other families from the county of Northumberland decided to immigrate to the U.S. Once the families all agreed to immigrate, George was sent to Liverpool as the agent of their newfound colony to secure their passage. George left his home of Northumberland on a Monday morning and set off by foot to the town of Liverpool, 150 miles away. There he found a ship, secured the passage of the 13 families, set the date of sailing, and then returned to Northumberland. He stayed in Liverpool for only 4 hours, yet spent a total of 6 days traveling there and back, all to secure his family's voyage for a better life in New York City. In 1801, the 13 families traveled to Liverpool, where they set off for New York City. The voyage took 6 weeks. On July 3, 1801, they landed in New York City, one of the greatest cities in the entire world, which at the time was inhabited by no more than 70,000 people. George was out of money after spending all of his savings on the passage to New York for himself and his family. George looked for a job in his profession, but the families, which he traveled from Northumberland with, were anxious to have him remain with them. So they scraped together their savings and raised him the necessary money of $100 to pay his passage with his family to the interior of the state with them. The party made their way up the Hudson River by foot and wagon. George and his family decided to settle in western New York, the Ontario County in the Lake region. The country was new and scarcely settled, though it was one of the finest parts of the Empire State, and almost completely covered with primeval forests. They lived there for 13 years, growing and cultivating the land. The family moved once again to Caledonia, New York in 1814, mainly for the purpose of settling where they could have religious privileges. There, George bought 400 acres of land, upon which there were 14 acres of cleared land and a log house. The purchase price of this property was $8 per acre, and upon it he made a small payment. Here, for many years, the family worked away faithfully, struggling to reduce the debt upon the farm, which they finally succeeded in paying off entirely in the year 1830. As the children grew up, they took ownership of the farm after George died. From this point on, the Greys stayed in New York until George Grey Jr., son of George Grey Sr., moved to Ontario for health reasons. It was rather common in days of old to relocate to more friendly climates for health reasons. George Grey Jr. brought his family, which included Thomas Grey, who then married a girl named Elizabeth, and gave birth to William Andrew Grey, my great-great-grandfather. William Andrew Grey brought his family west from Ontario to Calgary in 1908, looking for a better life where land was available to farm. He eventually ended up farming on the Bow River due north of Springbank, where their old barn with fieldstone foundation is still standing. William and his family traveled from east of Calgary to Springbank in the 1930s. They were one of the poorest families to live in Springbank at the time. In 1948, William Gray died attending a service at Springbank United Church, now located across from Callaway Park. Since 1908, the Grays have lived in Calgary, working hard as farmers until my grandfather, Mel Gray, graduated from University of Alberta with an engineering degree. He married my grandmother, Margaret King, and had 5 children, Kenneth, Diane, Glenn, Donald, and Stuart. My grandfather ran the Canadian division of a large energy service firm and settled his family in Calgary after stops in Houston, Venezuela, and Australia. From there, all 5 of his children, including my father, had become very successful in their professions and in their family lives. Most families in North America have stories of their ancestors' immigration from their old country. I feel fortunate to have such a detailed information of this important historical time, and I feel even more fortunate to be part of the Gray family.